to get us started. Thanks, everyone. And Marnie, it's off to you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dana. Thank you to the GSA for hosting us and to all of you for joining us today. We're really looking forward to this program. This is part of pgEd and GSA's series of programming on meeting the moment and a strategies for contributing to a broad conversation on genetics and society. I'm Marnie. I'm the director of programs at pgEd, and I am calling in today from Natick, Massachusetts. And it's really my pleasure to introduce session on discussing genetics, exploring human sex variation through athletics. And this is an especially exciting one for us because this session focuses on a lesson plan that pgEd published on our website literally last night. It is, and I'll share a little bit more about the story of how that has come to be. But before we dive in, I should do my housekeeping. That we will be talking about controversial topics that raise a host of ethical questions, of sensitive issues that may be sensitive. And so we ask that everyone is respectful and kind with the presenters and with your fellow participants. The Genetic Society of America has a code of conduct for all its online events. The link is shown on the slide here. Nadine, if you could post it in the chat, that would be great. I don't anticipate we'll have any issues, but GSA staff will remove anyone who's disrupting the workshop. We are recording pgEd's presentation so that we can share it with those who could not make it to the webinar. We take people's privacy very seriously, and it's not our intent, and it is our intention not to record any of the participants. We only wish to share the presenters from pgEd and from our invited guest if they are willing. So if by chance participants are in the recording, we'll be sure to edit that piece out before we share the video online. So I am joined today by Robin Bowman and Dana Waring, my colleagues at pgEd, who have really both been driving forces in the curriculum on human sex variation that we're going to be sharing with you today. We're also really honored to be joined by Bria Brown-King, who is the Director of Engagement for Interact, which is a leading advocacy organization for intersex youth. And thank you to Bria for joining us to share best practices for how for talking about human sex variation in the classroom. And then we also, my colleague Nadine Vincentin is with us, and she is monitoring the chat and making sure that all the links we put up on screen are coming out through the chat as well, and we'll be able to share those with you after the session. Okay, so this is a little bit of a birthday party for pgEd and GSA, because we have now, this has been 1 year as of last week that we launched our joint initiatives. And really the goal is a shared one, an equitable and safe future as genomic technologies enter societal use. And I imagine that this is the goal for all of us who are coming to this program today. As with any goal, there's a lot of ways to get there. And thank goodness we need so many different approaches. And so Robin, if you can give them the next slide. pgEd's approach is through education and conversation about genetics. And actually, if I was going to add one piece, I would say for everyone, including everyone, so that people have the information that they want and need to make decisions in their daily lives, so that they feel that better equipped to advocate in their own best interests. And so scientists, so we are hearing the voices from our communities, especially those that have historically been marginalized and at times excluded from these conversations. So that we as a community of science, we're hearing those voices, because our science will be so much stronger if we are responsive to what our communities have to say, and their expertise. So yeah, thank you, Robin. We really take our approach out of the lab. We're based at the Department of Genetics at Harvard Medical School, and into people's living rooms very seriously and very literally. We will go anywhere and talk to anyone. And really the core is the same. We are there to have a conversation. We are not there to convince people that genetic technologies are right for them. We are not advocating for or against the use of genetic technologies. We are there for information, and to foster a dialogue where everyone is respected and can participate in any way that they choose. So we take this in a number of places, some of them shown on this slide. And really the reason, if Robin, you can go one more, the reason that we approached, actually back one, they are almost identical except GSA, because the reason that we are so excited for this partnership with GSA is because the magnitude of the work that needs to be done and that scientists are responsible for making sure it happens is huge. And pgEd is one small team, and yet the genetics community is a force and reaches across the United States and around the world. So we are really here to ask and invite your help. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit more about some specific next steps. Okay, so on to the lesson. As I said, it was published yesterday, and I hope you are joining us in this celebration. And the link for the lesson plan is here. Next slide. I would love to tell you that it was a very linear path from the initial idea to the actual work that you see online today. I would like to tell you that it was a fairly quick process, but that is not reality. And actually, I think the work is much stronger for it. So let me share a little bit more about what our reality looks like of pgEd's process. We have more of a long, winding, meandering road. And I'd like to share, I was really like last night, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the journey that we have been on. And I think maybe even since 2015, these ideas have been percolating in our minds. And next slide, Robin. And really the key ingredient has been and will all continue to be people. And we have been so fortunate to meet with educators, I'm looking at some teachers from Massachusetts, from South Dakota, some more from Alabama. I'm looking at, and then more recently we've been online. I'm looking at my colleagues from 3 different time points in pgEd's history, and the organization that Bria represents, Interact, who were so wonderful in sharing their insights for this work. But I will say this, and I will say this again later, far too late in the process. We can do better. We reached out far too late. But it really, this product that's online on our website is really the product of so many voices, and we kind of think about it as many authors. We could never name them all. Educators, scientists, ethicists, community leaders and advocates, and many, many, many students along the way. And we have an approach. We go out, we talk to people, we listen a lot. Actually, Dana would tell me before we go out, we do our homework as much as we possibly can, but there are many things we cannot find in any book. And if we do too much research, we will sit at home all our lives, and we need to be out into the world. And so we also learn by doing. We go out, we talk to people, we really listen, absorb, do more homework. And then over time, this idea evolves. And as you see at the end of this path today, this is the end product. Robin, next slide. The end product is really the result of the power of co-creation. The product that comes out of this is stronger. It is more authentic to the people who are represented. It is more meaningful. It is more useful for teachers and accessible by students. And so it's better, it's more impactful, the work. So we're really grateful to all the people who have joined us for this journey. And I think I might have one more slide or two more slides. This journey is never ending. So as much as we published this lesson online last night, we already have plans in the works for acknowledging all these amazing people who have contributed to this process in the document that's going to go online Friday is our goal. And we may hear something today that may start us on a new journey. And so we invite feedback, we invite critique, we invite perspectives that we have not considered because of the limits of our own experiences and the limits of the people who we've had the good fortune to talk with. So please, I mean, we do our best. We are a small team. I think Robin may have words with me later if I promise a new version, a major new update anytime soon. But we are always trying our best. And even if it's not online, the things that we learned today will surely be integrated into the presentations that we give in the next weeks and months. So where do we begin? So the path is complex, it's long, there's a lot of room for improvement to bring in the voices of people whose stories are being told in our curriculum, for them to have a seat at the table from the beginning, and to really shape this work how they want their stories told, so that this is really curriculum that is for, by, and with our communities. And so we begin, one more, last thing, Robin, I promise. We begin in the same place every time. Actually, Robin, I know you're gonna say this, genetics gets personal. And the story of this lesson, and Robin is gonna tell you this, is that years ago, Dana noticed that 23andMe has a landing page for people who come to their website and realize that the results about their chromosomes don't clearly align with the way that they answered the survey questions about their sex. And this is an experience that is going to be on the rise, we think, as genetic information becomes more and more available. So thank you all for being here. And with that, Robin, I will pass the baton over to you.
Right. Thank you, Marnie, for that introduction to kind of set the stage for the lesson that we're going to be talking about today. As Marnie said, this is fresh off the presses. We just officially published this lesson last night, although we have presented it in many iterations over the past several years and kind of honed it as we've gone. I'm going to try to walk sort of a line between presenting the information that's in the lesson, but also sort of talking about like what went into creating this lesson, our thoughts behind it, and sharing some information in terms of our experiences in teaching this lesson to audiences across the US. So, all right, so most of our lessons start with some sort of do now activity. This is a tactic we use. It's a process that we use to start our lessons by asking a question that gets people thinking about the topic that we're about to talk about, right? So here we ask people to imagine you're an elite female athlete competing at the international level. You identify as a woman and haven't considered other possibilities. One of your competitors questions whether you are truly biologically female and anonymously asks officials to investigate your sex. The group that makes the rules about who can compete is deciding whether you qualify as a female and should be able to participate. Okay, so that's just kind of setting the stage. And we asked, how do you think you would respond to this type of investigation? What do you think the investigation might involve? And what could the other athlete be thinking about, right? And we try to specifically frame this to set people up in a mindset of empathy, right? We want them to put themselves in the position of an athlete, who has worked their whole life and trained their whole life to arrive here at this, international competition. And suddenly it just feels like the rug's getting pulled out from under you, right? Because someone's questioning whether you are who you actually say you are. So I think that's a good, I don't know, it seems to serve us well to start our lessons off by putting people in that empathetic kind of mindset. And you can have people pair and share on these questions, or you can just facilitate a larger conversation around it. Well, then we share that this is not a made up scenario, but it actually describes a situation of Caster Semenya and other athletes through history who have experienced this, where they have been very successful as athletes, and then at some point their sex has been called into question through no fault of their own. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. Why have we had these questions coming out about the sex of elite athletes? And as Marnie said, this isn't a topic that is only within the purview of elite athletes. 23andMe does have a landing page that says, if you're here, it might be because your genetic sex from DNA analysis is different than your self-reported sex. There are many reasons this can happen, right? As direct consumer tests, direct consumer genetic tests are becoming more popular, people are gaining more access to information about their own personal genetic makeup. And we're learning things that, to be honest, just 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we never, it would have never crossed our minds to be able to just learn this stuff so casually, right? So, all right. So to kind of understand how this situation comes up, we need to talk about how sex is determined, right? And I'm guessing this group knows fairly well how sex is determined, but when we're writing these lessons, we're typically thinking about them being presented to, say, your average 10th grader, right? How can we facilitate this conversation, in a 10th grade biology classroom? But they work well in other settings, as well. But that's sort of the level that we're trying to put things at in these lessons. So, what we're typically taught in high school biology class is something like, well, human sex at the genetic level is mostly related to the X and the Y chromosomes. You either get 2 X chromosomes and you are female, or you get an X and a Y chromosome and you are male. If you get 2 X chromosomes, you're going to have an ovary, a uterus, a vagina. Estrogen is going to be your dominant sex hormone, and at puberty, breasts will develop. And if you get XY chromosomes, you're going to have a penis and testes, and at puberty, you're going to start growing facial hair, and I don't know if I said testosterone is going to be your dominant sex hormone, right? So a pretty simplified, you go this way or this way, and this is how sex is determined. But in reality, sex determination in humans is much more complicated. And this is a beautiful illustration that we got from Scientific American. And we don't take the time to go through this in detail, but basically what we want to show is that column that is on the far right shows the, sexual development of your typical XY male, right? The column that is second from the left shows the sexual development of that typical XX female. Everything in between represents different paths of sexual development that people may take. And these paths are usually left out of the conversation entirely, right? But the people who are in this path make up nearly 2% of the population. Anyone who goes through one of these other paths of sexual development would be considered intersex. All right, another important thing to talk about, like right off the bat, is the difference in what we mean when we say sex versus when we say gender. We do not see these as the same thing. You know, in our culture, kind of colloquially, we've seen people kind of conflate the two concepts, but really they're referring to two separate things. When we're talking about sex, we're talking about the classification of people into male, intersex, or female, based on physical characteristics like chromosomes, sex hormones, and reproductive organs. When we're talking about gender, gender is a person's sense of being a man, woman, both, neither, and it's based on societal ideas about masculinity and femininity, right? And a person's gender might be different than a gender that's typically associated with their sex assigned at birth. We're gonna run into some confusion with the language in this lesson because, well, I think it's in general because of people's discomfort with using the word sex, that oftentimes these tests that were used to determine whether or not athletes qualified to compete in women's competitions, they would call them gender verification tests as opposed to what they really were, which was sex verification tests. So you have to kind of lead into this with a conversation about the difference in that language. All right, so sports are often divided by sex, right? But how have we determined a person's sex? There's kind of three different approaches that have historically been used within sports to do that, including anatomy, DNA, and hormones, okay? And we're gonna talk about the different approaches that these athletic governing bodies have used to determine an athlete's sex. All right. So since women could first compete in track and field events at the Olympics in 1928, there have been voices that were suspicious of anything that was seen as unfeminine levels of performance, right? I mean, they want you to be a good athlete, but like if you were too good, they would be suspicious that something was going on, right? So in 1936, following the Berlin Games, the president of the USOC, Avery Brundage, demanded examination for sex ambiguities in all women competitors, right? He thought something was askew and that we needed to start examining these people in the women's competition to make sure that no one was trying to cheat here. So they decided that they were going to first verify the sex of these athletes by using examinations of the athlete's anatomy, right? So in 1944, the International Association of Athletics Federations, or IAAF, started requiring competitors in the women's events to submit medical certifications to verify their sex. One thing that has also happened, you'll see us referring to the IAAF, and this is a governing body who oversees like track and field events internationally. They have recently changed their name to World Athletics. So you'll see that name come up later and we'll talk about it. But early on in all the literature, you just keep seeing reference to the IAAF. Well, this didn't go over super well because people didn't trust that these certificates that athletes were bringing from a doctor in their home country could actually be trusted. They figured, well, that's easy to fake that, or to find a doctor in your home country that would make a fake certificate saying, oh, yep, this is a woman and she can compete in the women's competitions, whatever. So they decided they were going to go about it in a different way. So in 1966, the IAAF started to require competitors in the women's events to go through an actual anatomical exam at the event. And some of those even included what they called a nude parade, where the athletes would be paraded in front of a panel of doctors, or they would have gynecological exams done upon them to to prove their sex. Right? Obviously, this was controversial. I think a lot of people felt kind of degraded by it. They didn't like this process. And so the IAF and IOC, International Olympic Committee, decided to abandon these anatomy-based tests for something that they saw as more scientific, and they switched to using DNA-based tests to verify the sex of these athletes. So from 1967 until the 1990s, they would do this assessment of chromosomal sex by taking a cheek swab of all the participants in the women's events and using that to verify sex. So what were they looking for here? Again, as we said, at the DNA level, sex is primarily associated with the X and Y chromosomes, right? So typical female is going to have XX, typical male is going to have X and Y chromosomes. Oh, and we should share that while the X and Y chromosomes share a number of genes, the Y chromosome is only about 1/3 the size of the X, and it only contains 1/10 the number of genes. All right, so one of the tests that they did that when they would use these cells from the cheek swab is to look for what's called a Barbody. And so what a Barbody is an inactivated X chromosome. So in anyone that has more than one X chromosome, anything more than a single one will be inactivated and turn into what's called a Barbody, which will show up under a microscope as a dark spot near the nuclear membrane, right? So, when they were doing the test of these cells to determine sex, if they would look at the cells under a microscope and they saw this Barbody in there, this dark spot, they would say, okay, yes, this person is female and they can compete in the women's events. If they looked at the cells and they saw no Barbody, then this person would fail the sex verification test and not be able to compete. Another test looked for something called the SRY gene. So the SRY gene is typically found on the Y chromosome, and it's one gene among many that are found on the sex chromosomes as well as on other chromosomes that factor into sexual development. The SRY gene is a critical gene in suppressing the development of ovaries and promoting the development of testes, right? So when they would do these tests where they look for the SRY gene, if they would find the SRY gene, that athlete would fail the sex verification test, right? But things aren't as clear-cut as they seem, and there are actually instances in which this SRY gene can come off the Y chromosome and can land on an X. So there are people who will have two X chromosomes, but will have an SRY gene. All right, the trouble with these tests, which we've kind of alluded to already, is that sex is not binary. Like, we often think of sex in humans as being binary, as existing in two distinct and mutually exclusive categories, male and female, right? But as we saw in that diagram from Scientific American, right, that's not it. That's not the whole story. Some people are intersex and born on a spectrum between what we would consider a typical male and typical female. Broadly, you can divide intersex variations into two categories. One category involves sex chromosome aneuploidies. So this is variations that are caused by having an atypical number of sex chromosomes, anything other than 2 sex chromosomes, right? The other broad category is other variations that affect sexual development. So a person would have a typical number of sex chromosomes, 2 sex chromosomes, but other sorts of variations that may affect a person's anatomy, hormone production, the body's response to the hormones, or any combination of the above, right? So when we're talking about sex chromosome aneuploidies, I'm sure most of you have probably heard of these examples. When we do this, have this lesson in a high school classroom, a lot of this is new information. But a person can have Turner syndrome, where they just have a single X chromosome, Klinefelter, which is XXY, XYY syndrome, triple X syndrome, or mosaicism. And so a mosaicism, you're going to have some groups of cells that have one complement of sex chromosomes in them, and other cells that have a different complement of sex chromosomes in them. And often, this happens in early fetal development, where cells will divide and one cell will lose a chromosome, and then any daughter cells that come from that one will also not have that chromosome that's been lost, right? All right. So an example of an athlete who had genetic mosaicism is Eva Kowalkowska. She was a Polish Olympic sprinter, and she had XXXXY mosaicism, right? And in 1967, she became the first athlete to fail what they called at the time gender verification tests of these athletic authorities due to her extra chromosome, and was stripped of her medals and world records. Now, this is a situation like Ava, had grown up as a girl, woman, had never expected anything else, and wasn't aware of being a genetic mosaic until failing this test. Then, as we said, there are other variations that might affect sexual development, where the person has a typical number of sex chromosomes. One of those variations is androgen insensitivity syndrome. And in AIS, the body is either completely or partially unable to metabolize androgens, hormones related to male sexual development. So if people, if XY individuals have AIS, they're going to have less developed male features than typical males do. If a person with XY chromosomes has complete AIS, so they're completely insensitive to androgens, they're going to develop with anatomy that looks typically female, but internally they'll have testes instead of ovaries. So in 1986, there was a Spanish hurdler named Maria Jose Martinez Patino, who was disqualified after a sex verification test showed that she had XY chromosomes. She ended up protesting this based on having androgen insensitivity syndrome, and she was eventually reinstated. And now she's a professor, and she's written extensively on AIS and on sex testing in sports. Okay. Another variation is congenital adrenal hyperplasia. This is CAH, and it causes increased androgen production. And in a person with XX chromosomes, it can cause a range of sexual characteristics from typically male to combined male and female characteristics to typically female individuals. People with XY chromosomes can also have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, but it wouldn't result in an intersex variation because XY individuals already are androgen dominant. Oh, did I skip one? Oh. And then again, there are other genetic or developmental variations. We're not talking about all of them here because, again, variations that might affect XY individuals aren't going to be individuals who have been caught up in sex verification tests in athletics, because participants in the men's events have never been asked to prove or verify their sex, right? So we're not talking about all of those in this lesson. All right. So how common are intersex variations? The stats vary. Intersex variations as a group are quite common, occurring in as much as 1.7% of the population. We should note this number is not completely agreed upon by everyone, because there is not one agreed upon definition in terms of what counts as intersex, what falls under that umbrella. The other thing is that a lot of this research is pretty Eurocentric, and we know that some of these variations are more or less prevalent in certain populations around the world. So, but at 1.7% of the population, that makes intersex variations about as common as red hair or green eyes, right? And all of us can think of people that we know that have red hair or have green eyes, but a lot of people can't think of someone that they know that's intersex. And that's because there's this whole kind of phenomenon of intersex invisibility. And there's several reasons for this. One is that intersex people might choose not to share this personal information about themselves. I mean, none of us really just like go around talking about our personal sexual development, right? It's like not a topic of conversation that comes up between people naturally. And then another reason is that many intersex people don't even know that they're intersex. One reason could be that there are no outward signs for some people, so no reason to question anything. But another reason is because of this common practice of surgeries being performed during infancy or early childhood, right? And these surgeries are often decided upon by parents or doctors who will take an intersex child and they will decide to surgically alter that child's body to make them appear more like a typical male or like a typical female. Unfortunately, many of these surgeries are medically unnecessary, right? These surgeries would be necessary if, for example, there's no way for urine to leave the body, right? That would be like a necessary reason to perform genital surgery on an infant. But the other problem is that these doctors and parents can't easily guess what this child's eventual sense of self is going to be. So sometimes they are making a decision to, alter these children's bodies very early in their lives. And then later on, this just doesn't go right to the person. And sometimes they're never told these surgeries were done, and other times they're lied to about why they had surgeries at a young age. All right. So as we said, this practice of using the DNA-based tests went from the 1960s till the 1990s. In 1992, the IAAF ended chromosomal testing, and then in 1999, the IOC discontinued sex testing, but both organizations reserve the right to examine athletes if someone were to challenge their femaleness. All right, so then we moved into kind of the age of using hormone levels to determine eligibility. So starting in 2000, testosterone levels were used to determine eligibility to compete in women's events. All right. Shoot, I think I may have skipped a slide. Okay, so we talk about like what is testosterone, right? It's important to drive home to students that testosterone is a hormone. It's produced in both male and female bodies. There's this like common misconception that like, oh, testosterone is for males, estrogen is female. No, everybody has both testosterone and estrogen. This hormone is important for growth and strength of bones and muscles, and it causes puberty-related changes in males, and it's essential for the body's overall health. When we look at testosterone levels, they vary from one person to the next. These shaded boxes show the reference ranges for typical females and typical males. And then these darker colored bars, the blue bars, show the testosterone levels of elite female athletes. And these are elite male athletes in the green bars. And what we notice here is that, there is a broad spectrum of testosterone levels. There's significant overlap. I mean, you can see the females are clustered, kind of down here below 3 in general, but we do see testosterone levels kind of going up to about 31 for females. And then if we look at the range for these male athletes, right, we see male athletes with testosterone levels all the way down at like 1 and all the way up to 41. So a much broader span. So when the IAAF originally started using testosterone limits to determine eligibility, they set the threshold at 10 nanomoles per liter if you wanted to compete in women's events. And there were a couple of kind of high profile cases of athletes who were disqualified based on this rule. So in 2009, Caster Semenya was disqualified based on elevated levels of naturally occurring testosterone. And that's the important thing too. This is naturally occurring testosterone. These are not examples of athletes who are doping, that are, injecting themselves with testosterone and an attempt to cheat. Like, this is these people's bodies producing hormones at the level that their bodies produce hormones. Okay. So Caster Semenya, she ran a couple different distances of races, but really the 800 meters was her race. And then in 2014, there's an Indian Olympian who specialized in the 100 meters, and she also failed the sex verification test based on elevated levels of testosterone. After Caster was disqualified, she actually started taking medication to try to lower her testosterone levels, and she reports that basically they made her feel like trash. She was sick, she couldn't compete well, all sort of thing. But when Duty was disqualified and asked to take medication, she was like, no, like, this is medically unnecessary treatment, and I don't feel like I should have to do this unnecessary treatment to compete. And so she sued. So in 2014, Duty Chan brought legal challenges against the IAAF. And in 2015, the court suspended that 10 nanomole per liter limit and ordered the IAAF to provide scientific evidence of testosterone improving performance. And what they really wanted to show was that these women athletes who had testosterone levels that were elevated had an advantage over the rest of the field that was comparable to the difference that a typical male athlete had over a typical female athlete. So 3 questions they were looking to answer. One is, do naturally occurring elevated testosterone levels confer an athletic advantage? If so, at what level of testosterone does that advantage become unfair? And third, are testosterone-based eligibility requirements discriminatory? So they did a study where they looked at 21 women's events, and they found that competitors with the highest testosterone levels performed significantly better in 5 of those 21 events. And here we show in parentheses how much better, right? And we put on here kind of the definition of what significant means, because in non-scientific communities, significant means meaningful, right? But we need to know here that when we're talking about research, significant means that the difference is unlikely due to chance. All right, so we see the 5 events that showed an advantage associated with high testosterone. So hammer throw, pole vault, 400-meter hurdles, 400-meter race, and the 800 meters. So following this study, the IAAF decided that they would apply a new 5 nanomole per liter testosterone limit on 5 events. But these are the yellow ones are the 5 events that they decided they would impose this 5 nanomole per liter limit on. And for some reason, they didn't apply the new limit to hammer throw and pole vault, which were the 2 events that showed the highest correlation of improved performance associated with elevated testosterone. And this just shows kind of where they've moved that threshold. So this is a place where we would ask students to kind of discuss, how do you think that the IAAF chose which events would have the lower testosterone limit for eligibility? And then imagine if you were responsible for creating these rules, like, what information would you want to base your decision on? All right. And so there was like a long legal saga that drug on for a few years. But in 2019, the court ruled that although setting a testosterone limit for eligibility is discriminatory, it is, in quote, necessary, reasonable, and proportionate. And all legal challenges have been exhausted, and the IAAF rule stands. So what does that mean for the athletes we've talked about here? Duty Chan can still compete because the new limits don't apply to the 100-meter event, but Caster needs to keep her testosterone levels below 5 nanomoles per liter if she wants to run the 800 meters, right? So they gave athletes kind of 5 options. They can lower their testosterone levels through medication or surgery. They can participate in an event not covered by the regulation, like duty. They can enter only non-international competitions. They can compete in the men's division, or possibly compete in another distinct third division that does not yet exist. So you can see a quote here from Castor saying, "I'm a woman, I'm a world-class athlete, the IAAF will not drug me or stop me from being who I am." All right, then following this lesson, we have the students do a classroom exercise where they imagine being a doctor responsible for verifying the sex of competitors in the women's 800-meter race in an international track and field competition. We give them information on 5 different athletes, and then they have a chart to fill out that shows like kind of the different tests that have been used historically to determine eligibility. And then I just threw one example in here. So, you know, we might say an example athlete. So physical characteristics would be female genitals fully formed. This is how it was like written on the medical forms in like the Olympics, whatever. So if we were using an anatomical exam, this athlete would pass. Oops. Sorry. Genetic test findings. So Barbody, this athlete has a Barbody absent, so they would fail that test. An SRY gene is present, so they would fail if that was the test being used. And testosterone level at 25 nanomoles per liter, and they would fail that one. But it just goes to show that depending on which measuring stick you use, this athlete at certain points in history would have qualified to compete, and at other points in history, not qualified to compete. Right? And these might be the findings of, say, an athlete who was XY and had complete androgen and sensitivity, right? You would find perhaps something like this. All right. Then, so they do that for 5 different athletes. And then after the exercise, again, we have them kind of debrief, talk about how did it make them feel to make these decisions to pass or fail the athletes, or how did you make the decisions? How did it make you feel? Describe your thought process. Did you wish you had more information? And then what impact do you think your decision could have on the lives of the athletes involved? Again, bringing it back to that like empathy place. Like, what if you had to make this decision, and what might those implications be? And then in terms of what the future holds, you know, we kind of pose some questions like, why do athletic oversight organizations focus on testosterone levels and not other physical characteristics? Why are athletic oversight organizations setting lower or upper limit for women's events, but not for men's? And might we see a switch to competitive categories based on something other than sex? Right? Just what ideas do we have out there for, you know, we want there to be fair and meaningful competition, but what's the best way to do that? All right, then present some resources where people can learn more. So Radiolab presents Gonads, the episode called Duty. This is really a great series. The NIH, Axis, Interact, and HHMI, sex verification of athletes lesson. All right. So I tried to get through that quickly. Sorry if it took a little bit too long. Dana, am I tossing it to you here?
You are. Although it's going to go to Marnie and then back to me. But thank you for that. Robin, that was great. This is not an easy one to teach quickly, but you did it. Marnie, to you.
Yeah, and thank you, Robin. And I've seen you present this lesson several times now, and you still feel it. And there was just nothing like this in my training in molecular biology. And so I just wanted to interject briefly, let everybody digest, because it's so much to absorb. This video will be online for you to watch again. I feel like I will, and take notes. But I wanted to just talk for a minute about how important like our interdisciplinary team has been to pgEd. And it's interdisciplinary in terms of professional expertise, but also really thinking always about how we can broaden the life experiences on our team. And so from that presentation, you might guess something about Robin that you didn't know. that Robin's previous career was not in genetics, but as an athletic trainer, which, I mean, Robin is the only healthcare professional at pgEd. And it really, when I hear you talk about the anatomy and Robin, I see so much of your training in this. And I was thinking back to, I think, to when you applied to pgEd, Robin, and you said, I think you said that in your cover letter that you hadn't studied genetics since college, but it was clear you were already doing your homework. We met you on Skype because it was before Zoom was fashionable, I think back in 2018. And your energy, like just and excitement about genetics really matched, this letter that still really stands out in my mind. And so in 2018, I started to write to Robin, recruiting very hard to move out from Nebraska. So Robin was an athletic trainer at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and recruited Robin to move across the country to join pgEd. I can tell you that we benefit from Robin's work as a healthcare professional. Robin, I think, doesn't have free time. Well, that's not true. Robin does enjoy free time with your family, but constantly busy and like bringing work in education and advocacy. It's everything that you do. And so we are so much stronger as an organization because of it. And from there, I would say turn to Dana, who is one of pgEd's co-founders way before my time. And Dana went to art school and studied women's studies. Dana, am I right? Like history of science and women's studies. And also really brings her work in education and advocacy from her personal life up in Maine into her professional work, where she is really the creative driving force behind pgEd's curriculum and works tirelessly to really keep on top of the scientific developments in genetics, the vast societal issues, and Robin also is doing that work. And Dana really has a knack for taking all of this. It's so much, I cannot hold it into my brain, even just that presentation that you just gave, Robin. And Dana has a knack for figuring out like, how do we make this relatable for high school students? And like, where are those personal connections that really provide the gateway? And I think Robin and Dana together like have really worked your magic in putting in this lesson. I see it really reflected. And so thank you for letting me interject, but I will pass it back to you.
Thanks, Marnie. So I am just going to quickly talk a little bit about some of our experiences actually going out and teaching this. And I am always the person at pgEd that is saying, for the so many people in the US, 10th grade biology is the beginning and the end of the formal education in biology. That what you learn in that class when you are 15 or 16, for many people, like that's it for biology class. And so we are always sort of looking to find these really important topics and things that people can connect to their lives. One of the things we found about this lesson, feedback we've heard from students and teachers, is it's very interesting for the students that are already interested in science and are sort of headed in that direction. But it also, will get the kids who are, athletes, thinking about law school, interested in policy, to sort of lift their heads up and say, oh, this is, we're in biology class, but this feels like something other than biology in a way. Why is that, right? And we're always sort of looking for those connections. So that is has been a really encouraging piece of feedback we've gotten on this lesson. The other thing I'll say is we have been really humbled to hear from teachers, veteran high school, public school teachers who have come to us after this and said, I am sitting here realizing that I have maybe been incorrect in some of what I have been teaching students. And I have been teaching it for a long time. And now I feel like I have a way and a set of tools to do that, you know. And I mean, I know as a person who regularly makes mistakes, that how, you know, it's hard to sort of be faced with that in your professional life, to say, ooh, I have, you know, been part of sort of advancing these ideas that maybe are leaving people out, or leaving kids in my classroom feeling unseen. Or, you know, I'm sending kids off to college and beyond that might, you know, have these misconceptions. And so we've really been appreciative of teachers that have helped us along the way to get this together. I will say another reason that, like, another thing that grabbed me about this subject was I was lurking around some message boards where there were some people talking about, you know, again, it's sort of similar to the 23andMe example, where, you know, genetic information delivered to an expectant parent, where there's, you know, chats where they're saying, we got a visual, we had a picture of the developing fetus, and the doctor said, oh, it's a boy. And then we did genetic testing, and the chromosome said, maybe it's XX, right? And I was seeing this sort of chatter saying, how come like these two diagnostic tests gave me two different pieces of information? Which again got us thinking that these are issues that are sort of coming into the mainstream for people in moments that they're not necessarily expecting it. The last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Bria is, we had an experience this summer where a teacher shared with us that they had been, you know, for many years giving students an assignment where they say, go forth and learn about a genetic disease, right? And I use quotes on that because in our lesson, part of what we're trying to do is to say, like, sometimes things that have been categorized as a disease, that many people would disagree with that and say it is a difference, it is a variation, but don't want that sort of connotation of disease. But nonetheless, the teacher had given an assignment, and a student stood up and presented sort of laundry list of like symptoms and problems associated with Turner syndrome. And that teacher came to realize they had a student in class who had Turner's, who had not been told until that moment in class from a classmate about the reproductive implications. And we spent some time as a group really like processing around the need when you're teaching is to recognize that you've got kids in front of you that have these, you know, variations, and that to think about them, put the humanity back into the teaching, right? And so that is something that has really stayed with us. And as I'm gonna turn this over to Bria, then I'll be back in a little bit to sort of help facilitate some questions and conversation. So we hope to start like seeing those in the chat or have them on your mind. But before, like I said, I'm so thrilled to introduce Bria joining us today. Bria uses they and she pronouns and identifies as Black, queer, non-binary, intersex, and masculine presenting. Bria is the Director of Engagement at Interact, Advocates for Intersex Youth. They work to build and cultivate relationships with stakeholders and raise awareness about intersex issues. Bria started doing intersex advocacy work as an intern with Interact, where they published articles for the ACLU, Teen Vogue, and Them magazine. They were also the first openly intersex person to speak about intersex issues on the steps of the Supreme Court. Bria also serves as an advisory board member for multiple organizations representing intersex people nationally and internationally. Thanks so much for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's such an honor to be here. As Dana said, my name's Bria, pronouns are they and she. I am the Director of Engagement at Interact Advocates for Intersex Youth, and we are a national intersex policy org working really hard to protect the rights of intersex children in the US. Our mission primarily focuses on ending harmful medical practices that are unfortunately imposed on intersex children. Work with other organizations and government agencies to make sure that intersex people are included in things like discrimination protections on the basis of sex, because we believe that sex-based discrimination protections also includes a person's sex characteristics or intersex traits. And again, it's such an honor to be here with you all and share this space. And I was invited here today to speak a little bit about my own personal experience as an intersex person, as an advocate. I was also an athlete myself for a little while. And so this topic of genetics and sex testing in athletics is something that I feel actually quite passionate about. And I'll finish my brief talk off by sharing some helpful reminders and some best practices for you all, to kind of keep in mind when you're interacting with intersex communities through your work and educating about intersex issues. Next slide, please. And so my intersex variation is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or what we commonly refer to as CAH. Robin talked a little bit about it earlier. CAH is one of the more common intersex variations. As you see here, about 1 in 15,000 children are born with CAH. And so I'm going to offer just a simple and brief definition of what this means. I'll first say that it took me many, many years to wrap my mind around CAH. Oftentimes, medical language isn't accessible to the average layperson, such as myself. And I think that being able to explain things in a way that makes sense is really, really important. And so I was born with XX chromosomes. I was also born with ovaries, a uterus, and all of my internal reproductive organs were developed and fully functioning. But my body doesn't produce enough cortisol. And as many of us know, cortisol is a stress hormone that all of our bodies needs to function properly. It regulates things like our blood sugar and helps our body respond to stress. And so to compensate for that lack of cortisol, my body naturally produces higher levels of testosterone. And as we spoke about earlier, testosterone produces what we typically refer to as the quote unquote secondary male characteristics. And so the characteristics that I developed during puberty included facial and body hair, enlargement of my Adam's apple, heavier bone structure, etc. However, my puberty was also feminizing as well. I was growing breast, and though it was very irregular, I also was menstruating as well. But it was sort of a confusing experience for me, because in society, we get taught that there are only boys and there are only girls, and boys develop one way, girls develop another. And because my doctors never really explained what was really happening to my body in a way that I understood, I couldn't explain it to anyone else. All I knew was that my body wasn't fitting neatly into these binary boxes. There are also different types and subtypes of CAH as well that I won't get into. But I will say that not everyone with CAH identifies as intersex. Oftentimes, we hear things like in the CAH community, folks will say things like, oh, well, my child isn't intersex because she is a quote unquote real girl because she has XX chromosomes and can conceive naturally. I had a parent tell me that I was asking young girls to kind of give up their womanhood by supporting the work that we do at Interact, by supporting bills and legislation to end non-consensual genital surgery on intersex children. because there are still people in this society who believe that, womanhood is defined by a woman's ability to have penetrative sex with a man and have babies, which is unfortunate. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, this idea of womanhood and why it's so harmful a little bit later on. Next slide, please. And so sometimes people don't learn that they're intersex until they start puberty, which for me, that's when I personally came to the realization. But I was born with genital differences that were apparent at birth, but I personally didn't know my genitals were different until people started to point it out to me, whether it was a babysitter who was giving me a bath or my peers in the locker room, for example. Something also common for kids with my specific intersex variation is that we experience precocious puberty, which just means that I went through puberty at a really early age. I was in about 2nd grade when puberty started for me. So not only was my body changing, it was changing far earlier than the rest of my peers. I had a beard, hairy legs, an Adam's apple, terrible acne, excessive sweating, and I had all of that before the age of 9. But again, unfortunately, I didn't have access to the knowledge and information to explain really why my body was changing the way that it was. And of course, kids and even other adults, family members, teachers, folks were curious and they wanted to know what was going on with my body. I wanted to know too. And they would ask me questions that I just didn't have the answers to. And actually, my first experience with raising awareness about intersex issues and talking about my experience as an intersex person was in 2011 during a class presentation when I was a freshman in college. And that's when I first became aware of Castor Semenya, when I was preparing for that presentation. And I learned that, Castor had actually been fighting this battle since 2009, when she won the 800-meter world championship title in Berlin, when she was, I believe, 18 or 19. The first thought that I had was, this could have easily have been me. I mean, I ran track in middle school, but like most other things, I had to quit because I was bullied pretty severely because of my intersex traits. And I didn't really feel safe going to practice. The same with soccer when I was in high school. Nobody really wanted an intersex kid on their team. But I can assure you that I was not inherently an athletic person due to my, intersex variation, my testosterone levels. I had terrible bone health due to my, due to CAH and my medication. I also had pretty severe asthma. So I was not out there winning any gold medals of any sort. But trans and intersex women, are not born with gold medals in their hands, despite what folks might like to tell us. Next slide, please. So, there's this idea that women are supposed to look a certain way. And to be honest, when I hear parents talk about not wanting an intersex child, I really hear them saying that they don't want a child that looks like me. And to add a layer of intersectionality to this idea of womanhood, we know that there has been a history of Black women's bodies being perceived as too masculine, right? And, like I said before, it's even worse when you're a person with power and influence, when we're talking about the Olympics and Castor Semenya and Black women's bodies, this discourse is rooted in both anti-transness and anti-Blackness and, society's jaded perception of what it means to look like and to be a woman, especially if you're a Black person. This idea that, if you're a woman, you can't be too tall, you can't be too muscular, because those traits are inherently associated with men and masculinity. And so, we can sort of start to see kind of how all of these issues intersect. Castor Semenya's right to privacy was completely violated when her test results were leaked to the press. And, that's when the rumors started started to spread about the test being done to measure her testosterone levels. And I actually believe that this happened just hours before the race was about to start, and then she was deemed ineligible to compete. The same sort of thing again happened with Duty Chan. And, talking about privacy violations, imagine having your private medical information just plastered in the headlines for the entire world to see. Also, it's clearly discriminatory because it only applies to women's sports. We're not having the same conversation about men and men's sports. And as someone, again, who was born intersex with high levels of testosterone, I can assure you that I am not inherently athletic, despite what my body might look like. And so I'll just finish this slide by saying that I really think it's time for us to reimagine the way that we think about sex and gender, and imagine a future where everybody has the right to self-determination. Next slide, please. And so this is just a reminder that anti-trans legislation, it also affects intersex as well. And I'll just speak about the first point here and the last point, because I know we're running low on time. We're probably all familiar with these anti-trans bathroom bills that say that trans people have to use the bathroom according to the sex that they were assigned at birth. A bill like this would also affect intersex people, because what about intersex women who were born with AIS or androgen insensitivity syndrome, as we mentioned earlier, who have XY chromosomes? Bathrooms do they use? What about me? I have XX chromosomes, but when people see me, they see a man. Which bathroom am I supposed to use? And so when it comes to the anti-trans sports bills, we see that there's almost this obsession with women and women's bodies and their testosterone levels. Talk about the patriarchal policing of women's bodies. And while these bills are meant to target trans and intersex women, cisgendered women are also affected as well, because it means that anyone's gender can be called into question if you don't fit society's definition of womanhood and what a woman is supposed to look like, which leads us to, there's this idea of womanhood is just such a bogus social construct. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to finish off by sharing, offering some helpful reminders for folks to keep in mind. Intersex people, again, we are not born with gold medals in our hands, and unfortunately, all intersex people are different. Not everyone has had surgery, right? We all don't have the same experience. And some people with intersex variations, again, don't even identify as intersex. So intersex experiences are not a monolith. Not all intersex people are non-binary or LGBTQ. Non-binary usually describes a person's experience with their gender. Some intersex people, are non-binary, but again, it's always important to check with the individual instead of making assumptions. Intersex is not a gender or a sexuality. Again, intersex is used as an adjective to describe someone's body and their sex characteristics. So a person can have a specific gender and also be intersex. So I can be intersex in a woman, I can be an intersex man, I can be intersex and trans, intersex and non-binary. Again, it really just depends on the person. Don't make assumptions about intersex people's experience. The term hermaphrodite is an outdated term. You might see some folks in the intersex community who have reclaimed the term, but I would say that it's still seen as pretty derogatory. Again, it's always important to check with the individual, to see which language they prefer to use when talking about their bodies. Disorders of sex development, also referred to as DSD, is often used in the medical community. We try to stay away from any sort of pathologizing language like disorders or anything like that when referring to intersex communities. saying that someone is intersexual can it can be misleading because it sounds like a sexuality to describe someone who's only attracted to intersex people. So it's not a term that's commonly used in the English language. And then, you know, we try to avoid saying things like I was born with both sex traits or sex traits of both, because this can cause some confusion. And you know, it implies that there are only two possible binary combinations of sex traits. And also, you know, it's important for us to understand the connection between intersex and how it relates to the broader LGBTQ plus movement, especially as we, you know, move towards being more intersex inclusive. Intersex people face challenges that are very similar to those in the broader LGBTQ plus community. And we have a common cause in, you know, fighting for our rights as people who don't fit into society's traditional idea about binary norms like sex and gender. We also face discrimination that is, you know, rooted in homophobia, transphobia, and stigmatization that, you know, continues to harm the LGBTQ plus community even today. And, you know, something that we want folks to keep in mind is that what the intersex community and the trans community, for instance, have in common is that we all want the autonomous right to make decisions about our bodies. You know, society sees intersex bodies as disordered and something that needs to be fixed, and that's just not true. And so next slide. Here are some resources that you can find on our website. I'll post a link in the chat here. We have a plethora of resources. Resources for parents, resources for teachers, resources for doctors. I highly recommend that you check it out. And next slide, if you're interested in getting involved, you know, you don't have to be an intersex person to be an advocate. We work on legislation throughout the country and always are looking for folks to lend your voice, share testimony, write a letter of support. Next slide, please. And of course, you can always follow us on social media to stay up to date on all of the things that we are up to at Interact. And thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure. I hope I didn't go over, hopefully I wasn't speaking too fast. I kept looking at the clock, so.
You know, Bria, as like a career scientist, I can tell you talking fast is what we are accustomed to. And when we don't hear it, we might sometimes get a little bit uncomfortable that it's not moving at the pace we like. Probably not true for everybody, of course, but that's my experience of it. And we're gonna change plans a little bit. So Robin, actually, we're gonna switch things around. You know, Bria, we're grateful that you joined us today and shared your time with us. And like, we want to hear from you. And so I thought that we would move the wrap up first as we're getting close to 1:30. And I'd like to just do a short wrap up, but then leave time. Some people will have to sign off because their schedules are booked right at 1:30 when we're scheduled to end. That might even be true for my pgEd colleagues, and that might be true for you, Bria. So I'm thinking and talking in real time. I didn't have a plan for this, but one is going to emerge quickly based on what people's availability is. And if you are scheduled, we completely understand. We'll find other ways to absorb questions, and maybe we can reflect with you later. And so we can think about how to respond to the people who were kind to join us today. So unless somebody gives me like maybe pgEd, Bria can give me like a thumbs up or thumbs down if you can stay for like no more than 30 minutes. And GSA team, please, I know you're in the background, I can't see you. But I see questions already coming in. Thank you, Claire. We will do our best to get to as many questions for those of you who are able to stay and to share some of the discussions with you afterwards. Okay, thank you, Jessica. So if we can move, Robin, now I've lost track of what slide number, but it's the one that says wrap up, reflection, and next steps. This one, okay. Now, Bria, I apologize because I'm about to put you on the spot, but I also feel maybe we rushed you a little bit. Is that one of the things I wanted to do in closing, and I hadn't had a chance to ask you yet, was just any final reflections, if you did feel at all like you had to rush through. I really appreciate you leaving us with ideas for what we as individuals can do. So I just made a slide with the 4 slides that you had with some suggestions for us, and invite you maybe to add anything you'd like in the next minute or so, and then I'll spend the same amount of time to wrap up on our side. How's that sound?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much. I think something that I didn't get to mention is that, for me as an intersex person, I think what made the biggest difference in my life was getting connected to peer support groups, because many of us grow up feeling isolated. We're told that we're really rare, and we grow up thinking that there's not a whole lot of other people out there like us. And so I do want to say that if you have an intersex person in your life, or if you are going to give a talk, and maybe you have students in your classrooms that might be intersex, to know that there are peer support groups out there for folks of all ages, and support groups for parents as well.
Thank you. And Robin, for my wrap up, can you advance 2 slides, please? And just to say that in 2022, that we want this to be a conversation that keeps going with you in the new year. If you need to step away, we hope that you will stay if you're able to, and join us to keep this, to talk with us now. But if you have to step away, we wanted to let you know that in 2022, we want to do more programming like this, invite more voices at the table in our genetics community, more interactive experiences, smaller groups. We really want opportunities to hear from you and build community within GSA around this mission. Here are 2 ways that you can stay tuned: Slack, share email on our survey. If you're not sure if you signed up for the survey before, sign up again. We can always just avoid the duplication on our end. So with that, Nadine has posted those links in chat. Thank you. And I'm gonna then go back, and maybe we can stop sharing. We'll say goodbye and Happy New Year, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you to the people who have to step away, and turn off the slides, and we will get started with, I see some questions coming in already. So Dana.